Number 1. Peter Sellers. There is a unique kind of intimacy we feel with the people who make us laugh. We invite them into our living rooms, we quote their lines at dinner parties, and we convince ourselves that we know the soul behind the smile. For decades, the world believed it knew Peter Sellers. To the public, he was the bumbling, lovable Inspector Clouseau of the Pink Panther series, a comedic genius whose very presence on screen promised joy and lightness. He was a chameleon, a man of 1,000 voices who could vanish into any character and make us forget our troubles. But behind the thick frames of those iconic glasses and the slapstick pratfalls lay a reality so starkly different from his on-screen persona that it chills the blood of those who witnessed it firsthand. While he spent his career making the world roar with laughter, his private life was defined by a silence, a cold, terrifying silence that descended the moment the camera stopped rolling. Before we pull back the curtain on this dark legacy, if you want to uncover the truth behind the glossy facade of fame, make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because the stories we are uncovering reveal that Hollywood's brightest stars often cast the darkest shadows, and no shadow was darker than the one cast by Peter Sellers. To his millions of adoring fans, he was a warm, approachable figure of fun, but to those who had the misfortune of entering his physical orbit, he was a man possessed by a fragile, volatile ego that could shatter a person's spirit in an instant. The tragedy of Peter Sellers is not just that he was a tortured genius, it is that he inflicted that torture outward, projecting his own inner misery onto the very people who helped build his legend. He didn't just want to be the star, he needed to be the sun, and anyone who flew too close was liable to be burned.
The true measure of a person is often said to be how they treat those who can do nothing for them. By this metric, the beloved comedian was a monster. On the sets of his blockbuster films, the crew members, the lighting technicians, the sound engineers, the prop masters, who worked tirelessly to make him look good, were not viewed as collaborators. To Sellers, they were barely viewed as human. Reports from his production sets paint a picture of a man who treated his team with a disdain that bordered on pathological. He viewed them as furniture, as obstacles, or worse, as targets for his unpredictable rage. There was no camaraderie, no shared jokes between takes, only an atmosphere of walking on eggshells, where a single misstep could unleash a torrent of abuse. The people who suffered the most were his personal assistants. In the high-stakes world of film production, mistakes happen. It is the nature of the business. But for an assistant working under Sellers, a mistake was not a professional error. It was a personal insult to his genius. If a coffee was cold or a script page was out of order, the reaction was not annoyance, but a calculated, humiliating evisceration. He was known to dress down his subordinates in front of the entire cast and crew, using his mastery of language not to entertain, but to dismantle their dignity piece by piece. He would zaleel them, utterly humiliate them until they were reduced to tears, feeding his own ego with their powerlessness. It was a power dynamic he relished. The man who played the fool so brilliantly on camera demanded to be treated like a god off camera, and his wrath was the price paid by anyone who dared to remind him of his own humanity. It was a psychological cruelty that left scars long after the production wrapped, a testament to a man who saw other people merely as extensions of his own will, to be used and discarded.
Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this duality was reserved for the fans. These were the people who bought the tickets, who waited in the rain for hours just to catch a glimpse of the man who brought so much light into their lives. They would approach him with trembling hands, holding out a piece of paper and a pen, hoping for a moment of connection, a shared smile, perhaps a quick joke in the voice of Inspector Clouseau. But instead of warmth, they were met with a wall of ice. Sellers did not see his fans as the reason for his success. He saw them as an intrusion. When asked for an autograph, the mask of the comedian would slip entirely, replaced by a look of profound hostility. Witnesses describe his reaction not as simple annoyance, but as a deep, simmering anger. He would fix his admirers with a cold, dead stare, a look so devoid of empathy that it terrified those on the receiving end. He wouldn't shout, he would simply look through them, making them feel small, intrusive, and unworthy of his air. It was a silent rejection that said, "You are nothing to me." The man who made a living mimicking the human condition seemed entirely, completely detached from it in reality. He demanded adoration from the masses, but despised the individual. It leaves us with a haunting question. Can we ever truly separate the art from the artist when the artist holds us in such contempt? Peter Sellers died leaving a legacy of laughter on film, but a legacy of tears for those who tried to get close to him. But if you think Sellers' coldness was shocking, it pales in comparison to another British legend who didn't just ignore his fans, but actively revolted against them. Our next subject was a comedy icon who viewed the adoring public as a literal contagion, referring to them as bacteria, and famously calling them the Great Unwashed.
Number 2. Kenneth Williams. He called them the Great Unwashed. It was a phrase dripping with a specific kind of aristocratic disdain, a label that instantly erected a fortress between the man and the millions who adored him. Kenneth Williams was a titan of British comedy, a man whose rubber-faced expressions and flared nostrils became the visual shorthand for an entire era of humor. In the Carry On films, he was the master of the double entendre, a camp, outrageous figure who invited the audience to laugh along with his frantic, high-pitched theatrics. When you saw Kenneth Williams on screen, you felt you were watching a man who lived for the joy of performance, a man who reveled in the messy, chaotic absurdity of human life. But the moment he stepped off the soundstage, that revelry turned into a profound and disturbing revulsion. To Williams, the public wasn't just an audience, they were a biological hazard. The contrast between his public image and his private neuroses is one of the most jarring in entertainment history. While his characters were often knee-deep in farce and physical comedy, the real Kenneth Williams navigated the world with a terrified fastidiousness. He didn't just dislike crowds, he feared the very essence of other people. Diaries published after his death reveal a mind tormented by the proximity of others, a man who looked out at the sea of faces applauding him and saw only a breeding ground for filth. It is a peculiar tragedy to be a man whose livelihood depends on the love of the masses, yet whose personal happiness depends on staying as far away from them as possible. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, desperate for the validation of fame, but physically sickened by the people who provided it.
This was not merely a case of a celebrity wanting privacy. It was a manifestation of a deep-seated obsession with hygiene that bordered on the pathological. Williams viewed his fans through a lens of extreme prejudice, equating the common person with bacteria. Imagine living a life where every handshake, every pat on the back, every brush of a shoulder in a crowded hallway felt like a contamination event. For Williams, the adoring public was a swarm of germs threatening to breach his sterile sanctuary. When fans approached him, beaming with the excitement of meeting their idol, they weren't met with gratitude. They were met with a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. He would recoil physically, his famous face twisting not into a comedic grimace, but into a genuine snarl of disgust. He believed with a disturbing intensity that the common people were inherently dirty. It wasn't just about unwashed hands. It was a moral judgment he projected onto their physical beings. He saw their enthusiasm as a form of pollution. Witnesses from that era describe scenes that are painful to recount. Eager fans stepping forward, perhaps looking a bit disheveled from a long day's work, only to be verbally swatted away as if they were vermin. He treated the air around him as if it were rarefied, exclusive territory that the bacteria of the general public had no right to breathe. It raises a difficult question about the nature of celebrity. Do we own a piece of the stars we make? And if we do, what happens when they look at us and see nothing but disease? For Kenneth Williams, the barrier wasn't just velvet ropes and security guards. It was a psychological wall built of soap, water, and an intense loathing for the human touch.
There was one scenario, however, that triggered a rage in Williams unlike any other. If you were unfortunate enough to spot him while he was dining, and you made the fatal error of approaching him for an autograph, you were not just annoying a celebrity. In his mind, you were launching an assault. To Williams, the act of eating was a private sanitary ritual,
For a stranger to encroach upon that space, to lean over his table with their breath and their paper and their pen, was perceived as a violent violation. Stories abound of fans who, spotting the comedy legend at a restaurant, approached with a polite "excuse me," only to be met with a reaction that resembled a person fending off a physical attack. He would gasp, recoil against the back of his chair, and lash out with a venom that left onlookers stunned. He acted as though the fan had brandished a weapon rather than a notepad. It was a defensive mechanism gone haywire, a response so disproportionate that it left his admirers not just rejected, but deeply shaken. They came looking for a laugh and left feeling like criminals. It paints a portrait of a man who was deeply, profoundly unhappy, a man who built a career on making people smile while he himself was wincing at their existence. He died a beloved figure on screen, but in reality, he was a man who spent his life trying to scrub the world off his skin. But while Williams hated the fans, our next subject hated the very role that made him an immortal legend. He was a knight of the cinema, a man of gravitas who found himself trapped in a galaxy far, far away. You might know him as a wise, benevolent mentor, but in real life he famously made a child cry by promising an autograph only if the boy agreed to never watch his most famous movie again.
Number 3. Alec Guinness. He was a titan of the stage, a man who had breathed life into the complex kings of Shakespeare and the subtle, broken heroes of David Lean's masterpieces. Sir Alec Guinness was the definition of gravitas, an actor who commanded respect through silence and the slightest arch of an eyebrow. Yet, history has a cruel sense of irony. To the vast majority of the world, this classically trained virtuoso became synonymous not with Hamlet or Prince Faisal, but with an old wizard in a brown robe waving a laser sword. The role of Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars brought him wealth and a level of fame that most actors can only dream of, but to Guinness, it was a golden cage that he loathed with a passion bordering on despair. He didn't just dislike the film, he viewed it as an affront to his craft, a descent into fairy tale rubbish that overshadowed a lifetime of serious artistic achievement. Imagine the psychological torment of a man who prides himself on intellect and depth, suddenly finding himself worshipped by a generation obsessed with space battles and imaginary forces. Every piece of fan mail, every screaming child, every plastic action figure bearing his likeness felt like a mockery of his true talent. He felt as though he had been reduced to a caricature, trapped in a universe of banality that he couldn't escape. While the world saw a wise mentor, Guinness saw a paycheck and a script he found excruciatingly dull. His letters from the set reveal a man in agony, complaining about the rubbish dialogue and the endless boredom of special effects filmmaking. This resentment festered, turning the adoration of his fans into a constant reminder of what he considered his greatest artistic failure. He was a man drowning in applause for the one performance he wished he could erase, creating a bitterness that would eventually spill over into the real world in one of the most infamous interactions in celebrity history.
This internal conflict created a wall between Guinness and the public that was colder than deep space. He could not comprehend the obsession. To him, Star Wars was a silly children's movie, a piece of fluff that should have been forgotten a month after its release. He couldn't grasp why grown men and women were dissecting its lore, or why children looked at him with such reverence. This disconnect bred a specific kind of intolerance. When fans approached him, their eyes wide with the magic of the movies, Guinness didn't see innocence. He saw a reflection of the cultural decline he despised. He felt a responsibility, perhaps a misguided one, to snap them out of their trance, to tell them that there was more to life than Wookiees and spaceships. The pressure of this unwanted legacy followed him everywhere. He could be dining in a fine restaurant or walking down a quiet London street, and suddenly he would be accosted by the line, "May the Force be with you." It was a phrase that made him physically cringe. It was the sound of his artistic integrity being chipped away, syllable by syllable. He began to view the fans not as admirers, but as victims of a mass delusion, and he, the unwilling prophet of this new religion, wanted nothing more than to abdicate his throne. This simmering resentment meant that interactions with fans were fraught with tension. He wasn't just a grumpy old man. He was an artist in mourning for his own career,
lashing out at the very people who were keeping his shame alive. It was a powder keg of ego and regret, waiting for a spark. And that spark came in the form of a young boy, full of hope, who simply wanted an autograph from his hero, unaware that he was walking into a trap set by a man desperate to kill the myth of Obi-Wan Kenobi once for all.
The story has become a legend in its own right, a dark parable about meeting your heroes. It happened in San Francisco, where a young boy, breathless with excitement, approached Guinness. The child had seen Star Wars over 100 times. He knew every line, every scene, every gesture. To him, this was the greatest moment of his life. He asked for an autograph, his voice likely trembling with the sheer magnitude of the encounter. Guinness looked down at the boy, but instead of a benevolent smile, he offered a cruel bargain. He asked the boy if he really had seen the film that many times. When the boy nodded proudly, Guinness made him a deal. He said he would sign the autograph, but only on one strict condition. The boy had to promise right then and there that he would never watch Star Wars again. The request was a psychological gut punch. It took the thing the child loved most and turned it into a bargaining chip for a scrap of paper. The boy, confused and devastated, agreed, likely not fully understanding the malice behind the request. Guinness signed the paper, handed it over, and reportedly said, "Now go away." The boy burst into tears. It was a moment of shattering disillusionment. The wise Jedi had used his power not to inspire, but to crush a child's joy, simply to satisfy his own intellectual snobbery. Guinness later recounted the story with a sense of satisfaction, believing he had done the boy a favor by curing him of his obsession. But to the rest of us, it stands as a testament to how deep his hatred for the role truly went. He was willing to break a child's heart just to distance himself from a galaxy he never wanted to inhabit. But if Alec Guinness merely wanted to distance himself from his work, our next star embodied his most famous character a little too perfectly. He was the creator of the world's rudest hotel owner, but it turns out the disdain for stupid people wasn't acting, it was a way of life.
Number 4. John Cleese. We often comfort ourselves with the belief that the villains we see on screen are merely caricatures, exaggerated figures designed to make us laugh or cringe, but who hold no power in the real world. For decades, audiences have roared with laughter at Basil Fawlty, the manic, rude, and perpetually exasperated hotel owner from Fawlty Towers. He is the gold standard of bad customer service, a man who views his guests as irritants disrupting the smooth operation of his life. We laugh because we assume it is a performance, a brilliant satirization of the British stiff upper lip gone wrong. But for John Cleese, the towering genius behind the character, the line between the fictional hotelier and the man himself is dangerously thin. It turns out that the disdain Basil Fawlty felt for the general public wasn't just good acting, it was a documentary of Cleese's own internal monologue. He didn't have to dig deep to find that well of irritation, because he lives there. John Cleese operates with a towering intellect, a sharp, Cambridge-educated mind that has dissected the absurdities of life for over half a century. But this intelligence comes with a heavy price for those around him, a profound, unwavering intolerance for what he perceives as stupidity. Unlike the other stars we have discussed who might hate fans for their hygiene or their obsessiveness, Cleese's contempt is intellectual. He views himself as a superior being standing atop a mountain of logic and reason, looking down at a world populated by the dim-witted and the slow. To him, the average person isn't just a fan, they are a disappointment. Meeting him isn't a warm exchange of gratitude, it is an unspoken IQ test that most people are destined to fail before they even open their mouths. The tragedy is that his fans approach him expecting the silly walker from the Ministry of Silly Walks, but they are met with a cold, judgmental professor who has no patience for a student who hasn't done the reading.
This internal conflict created a wall between Guinness and the public that was colder than deep space. He could not comprehend the obsession. To him, Star Wars was a silly children's movie, a piece of fluff that should have been forgotten a month after its release. He couldn't grasp why grown men and women were dissecting its lore, or why children looked at him with such reverence. This disconnect bred a specific kind of intolerance. When fans approached him, their eyes wide with the magic of the movies, Guinness didn't see innocence.
He saw a reflection of the cultural decline he despised. He felt a responsibility, perhaps a misguided one, to snap them out of their trance, to tell them that there was more to life than Wookiees and spaceships. The pressure of this unwanted legacy followed him everywhere. He could be dining in a fine restaurant or walking down a quiet London street, and suddenly he would be accosted by the line, "May the Force be with you." It was a phrase that made him physically cringe. It was the sound of his artistic integrity being chipped away, syllable by syllable. He began to view the fans not as admirers, but as victims of a mass delusion, and he, the unwilling prophet of this new religion, wanted nothing more than to abdicate his throne. This simmering resentment meant that interactions with fans were fraught with tension. He wasn't just a grumpy old man. He was an artist in mourning for his own career, lashing out at the very people who were keeping his shame alive. It was a powder keg of ego and regret waiting for a spark. And that spark came in the form of a young boy, full of hope, who simply wanted an autograph from his hero, unaware that he was walking into a trap set by a man desperate to kill the myth of Obi-Wan Kenobi once for all. This behavior reveals a man who has become trapped by his own standards of perfection. He critiques the world relentlessly, finding fault in everything from modern society to the behavior of his admirers. It is a lonely existence to walk through life convinced that you are surrounded by idiots, but Cleese seems to wear this isolation like a badge of honor. He has spent a lifetime making us laugh at the absurdity of social norms, yet he enforces a strict, invisible hierarchy in his own interactions. The warmth that fans project onto him bounces off a hard shell of cynicism. He proves that being a comedic genius requires a sharp mind, but being a beloved human being requires a soft heart, something that seems to be missing from his interactions with the public. He is a man who demands excellence from a world that is messy and imperfect, and his inability to accept that imperfection makes him as prickly and difficult as the character he made famous. We leave the world of intellectual snobbery now, but we are about to ascend to a level of entitlement that makes John Cleese look humble. Our next subject didn't just think she was better than you because she was smarter. She believed she was better than you by divine right. We are moving from the kings of comedy to actual royalty. This next figure was a woman so consumed by her own status that she treated her staff not like humans, but like inanimate objects to be moved around a room. She was known to turn her face away in the middle of a conversation if you bored her, and she once famously looked at a beautiful supermodel and called her unfortunate looking, simply because she came from a working-class background. Welcome to the terrifying world of the palace.
Number 5. Princess Margaret. We move now from the intellectual arrogance of the comedy circuit to the rarefied air of the aristocracy, where the belief in one's superiority isn't just a personality trait, it is a birthright codified by centuries of history. Princess Margaret, the Countess of Snowdon and the younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, inhabited a world that few of us can even imagine. It was a world of gilded cages, tiaras, and a rigid social hierarchy where she sat at the very apex. But while a title commands respect, it does not mandate kindness, and Margaret was infamous for wielding her status like a bludgeon. To the public, she was the glamorous, rebellious royal, the life of the party in swinging London. But to those who were summoned into her presence, she was a figure of terrifying, icy judgment. This was not the rudeness of a bad mood, it was the rudeness of someone who genuinely believed she was made of a different substance than the rest of humanity. Her snobbery was legendary, a force of nature that could clear a room of warmth in seconds. In the circle she moved in, etiquette was a weapon, and she was a sharpshooter. Stories from courtiers and high society guests paint a picture of a woman who expected the world to bend to her whim without her having to utter a word. There was a suffocating tension that surrounded her, a constant fear that one might breach some invisible protocol and be cast into the outer darkness. She didn't just demand deference, she demanded total submission. If she felt that the conversation at a dinner party was beneath her, or if a guest failed to entertain her sufficiently, she wouldn't politely excuse herself, she would simply perform a social execution. She would turn her body away, presenting her cold shoulder to the offender, and refuse to acknowledge their existence for the remainder of the evening. It was a silence so loud, so crushing, that it left grown men and women trembling, reduced to nothing more than a nuisance in the periphery of her royal vision.
This dehumanization extended most cruelly to her staff. For the men and women who served her, fetching her drinks, lighting her cigarettes, organizing her life, there was no bond of loyalty or gratitude. To Princess Margaret, staff were not people with feelings, families, or exhaustion. They were merely animated furniture. They were there to facilitate her comfort, and like a footstool or a lamp, they were expected to be silent and invisible until needed. Reports suggest that she would often talk about them while they were in the room as if they weren't there, discussing their flaws or issuing complaints to a third party while the subject of her scorn stood just feet away, unable to defend themselves. It was a behavior rooted in a deep, antiquated belief that the working class existed solely to serve the ruling class, and any attempt by them to show personality or humanity was a breach of the natural order. Perhaps the most stinging example of her class-based cruelty involves the cultural icon Twiggy. In the 1960s, Twiggy was the face of a generation, a supermodel who defined the era's look. She was beautiful, successful, and beloved. But when she was introduced to Princess Margaret at a dinner party, the princess didn't see a star. She saw a girl from a working-class background who had risen above her station. Upon being introduced, Margaret looked the young model up and down with a withering sneer and asked her name. When Twiggy replied, "I'm Leslie, ma'am, but people call me Twiggy," the princess reportedly turned to her neighbor and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "How unfortunate looking." It was a devastating insult, delivered not because Twiggy wasn't beautiful, the whole world knew she was, but because Margaret wanted to remind her that no amount of fame could wash away her origins. She used her words to strip the girl of her confidence, reasserting that in Margaret's world, bloodline was the only beauty that mattered.
This behavior reveals the dark heart of entitlement. It is one thing to be born into privilege. It is another to use that privilege to belittle those who have had to fight for everything they have. Princess Margaret's legacy is a complex tapestry of glamour and tragedy, but the thread of cruelty that runs through it cannot be ignored. She treated interaction not as a two-way street, but as a performance where she was the critic and everyone else was failing the audition. Even in her later years, as her health declined and her social circle shrank, the haughtiness remained. She clung to her rank as a shield against a changing world, a world that was becoming increasingly democratic and less tolerant of such overt snobbery. She lived and died in a bubble of her own making, surrounded by people who feared her more than they loved her. Ultimately, her story is a cautionary tale about the isolating nature of ego. When you treat people like furniture, you eventually find yourself living in a very cold, empty house. The silence she used to punish others eventually became the silence that surrounded her. But while Princess Margaret used silence and a cold shoulder to assert her dominance, our next subject chose a path of absolute chaotic noise. We are leaving the polite, hushed drawing rooms of the palace and heading straight into the filth and fury of the punk rock scene. Our next star didn't just ignore his fans, he physically assaulted them. He didn't wear a tiara, he wore a swastika for shock value. And while Margaret treated people like furniture, this man treated them like targets for his spit and his fists. Prepare yourself, because the violence we are about to uncover is not emotional, it is visceral, bloody, and completely unhinged.
Number 6. Sid Vicious. We trade the velvet ropes and hushed tones of the palace for the rusty chains, safety pins, and visceral fury of the mosh pit. If Princess Margaret represented the cold, silent exclusion of the elite, Sid Vicious represented the screaming, spitting rejection of the gutter. As the bassist for the Sex Pistols, he was the poster child for the punk rock revolution, a movement that promised to give a voice to the voiceless. But the reality of Sid Vicious was far uglier than the romanticized rebellion we see on t-shirts today. To be a fan of Sid Vicious was to enter a combat zone, where the musician you idolized viewed you not as a supporter, but as a target. The relationship between Sid and his audience was defined by a toxicity so potent that it blurred the lines between performance art and genuine assault. When Sid stepped onto the stage, he didn't bring charisma, he brought a palpable sense of danger. He was a figure of chaos, often barely coherent, driven by a nihilistic rage that he directed squarely at the people who had paid to see him. In the lore of rock and roll, the concert is a communion, a shared energy between the artist and the crowd. For Sid, it was a war. He was infamous for spitting into the audience, not as a playful antic, but with the intent to degrade. He would unleash gob after gob of mucus onto the faces of the teenagers in the front row, treating them with a biological disrespect that is hard to fathom. But it didn't stop at bodily fluids. Sid was known to physically attack his own fans. He would swing his bass guitar like a medieval weapon, diving into the crowd to punch, kick, or bash anyone who looked at him the wrong way. The blood that flowed at a Sex Pistols gig was often real, and it often belonged to the fans who had come to worship at the altar of punk, only to find that the deity they prayed to wanted to hurt them.
This violence was fueled by a desperate need for shock value that overrode any sense of human decency. Sid Vicious treated the social contract as something to be shredded and burned. Nothing exemplifies this callous disregard for the feelings of others more than his choice of attire. He frequently wore a t-shirt emblazoned with a swastika. It is crucial to understand that this was not a political statement in the traditional sense. Sid was not a Nazi ideologue. It was something far more shallow and, in a way, more insulting. He wore the symbol of the greatest atrocity in human history simply because he knew it would upset people. He used the pain and suffering of millions as a fashion accessory to garner attention. It was a profound act of narcissism, a signal to the world that he cared more about being edgy than he did about the trauma of others. To the fans who were Jewish or who had lost family in the war, seeing their hero draped in that symbol was a betrayal that cut deep. It was a declaration that their history, their pain, and their humanity meant nothing to him compared to his desire to be the center of controversy. This behavior wasn't limited to the stage or the tabloids. It bled into his interactions with the everyday people who had the misfortune of crossing his path. The working-class hero image was a myth. In reality, Sid was known for being abusively rude to the very working-class people he was supposed to represent. Taxi drivers, waiters, and shopkeepers were often on the receiving end of his incoherent tirades. He treated service workers with a sneering contempt, screaming at them, refusing to pay, or threatening violence for the slyest perceived slight. He walked through London like a feral animal, believing that his fame and his punk status gave him a license to treat the common man like dirt. He didn't want to liberate the masses. He wanted to terrorize them.
The tragedy of Sid Vicious is that he hated himself as much as he hated everyone else. But he made sure that the people around him paid the price for his internal misery. He was a black hole of negativity, sucking in the energy and adoration of his fans and spitting it back out as bile. Those who approached him on the street expecting a moment of connection with the rebel icon were often met with a terrifying unpredictability. He might ignore you, he might scream at you, or he might try to fight you. There was no off switch to his aggression. He lived his life as a continuous act of hostility, a performance of hatred that eventually consumed him entirely. He died young, leaving behind a legacy that is often romanticized, but for the fans who actually stood in the splash zone of his spit and his rage, the memory is one of humiliation and fear. He taught a generation that no future wasn't just a lyric, it was a promise of how he treated the present. We leave the blood-soaked, chaotic venues of the punk scene now, and the silence that follows is deafening. But do not mistake silence for kindness. We are moving from the loud, violent rejection of the streets to the stiff, gray corridors of political power. Our next subject was the most powerful man in Britain, a prime minister who held the fate of the nation in his hands. But while Sid Vicious would scream at you, this man would simply sulk. He was known as the Incredible Sulk, a leader so socially awkward and disconnected from the common man that when people told him their problems, he didn't offer sympathy. He offered a lecture.
Number 7. Edward Heath. The transition from the violent, spit-flecked chaos of the punk rock underground to the sterile, carpeted corridors of Westminster is jarring, yet the emotional temperature drops even further. We leave the heat of the mosh pit for the deep freeze of political power. Edward Heath, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1970 to 1974, presided over a nation in turmoil,
a time of strikes, blackouts, and economic despair. But while the country was crying out for a leader who could offer a warm embrace or a word of reassurance, they got a man who seemed carved from a block of gray ice. Heath was a man of immense intellect and musical talent, a conductor who understood the complex score of government, but who was utterly deaf to the human notes played by the people he was sworn to serve. To the public, and even to his own colleagues, he was known by a moniker that was as funny as it was devastatingly accurate: the Incredible Sulk. This wasn't just a clever tabloid nickname, it was a diagnosis of his entire personality. Heath possessed a social awkwardness so profound that it manifested as rudeness. Entering a room with Edward Heath was described by many as walking into a vacuum where all the oxygen had been sucked out. He didn't know how to engage in the basic pleasantries that grease the wheels of human interaction. If he walked into a party or a meeting, he wouldn't smile, he wouldn't wave, and he certainly wouldn't ask how you were. He would simply stand there, his shoulders hunched, radiating a cloud of gloom and disapproval. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that made everyone around him feel instantly uncomfortable, as if they had done something wrong simply by existing in his presence. He treated the British public not as a constituency to be courted, but as a confusing, irrational mass that refused to behave according to his logical plans. The disconnect was absolute. He was a man standing behind a glass wall, mouthing instructions that no one could hear, and growing increasingly furious that they weren't being followed.
The true tragedy of Edward Heath's behavior lay in how he handled the suffering of others. In the early 1970s, people were hurting. Inflation was eating their savings, electricity was being rationed, and uncertainty hung over every dinner table. When ordinary citizens had the rare chance to meet their prime minister, they would often pour their hearts out, sharing their fears about the future, their struggles to pay bills, or their worries about their children's education. A natural leader, or even just a decent, empathetic human being, would offer a nod of understanding, a touch on the arm, a few words of comfort. But Heath did not operate on the frequency of empathy. Instead of listening, he would lecture. He would look at a distraught mother or a worried steelworker and launch into a dry, academic diatribe about global economic forces, trade unions, and fiscal responsibility. He treated their emotional pain as an intellectual error that needed to be corrected. If someone said, "I'm cold because the power is out," Heath would explain the intricacies of the coal miners' strike and the necessity of the 3-day week. He made people feel stupid for having feelings. He stripped their grievances of humanity and reduced them to data points, leaving them feeling smaller, colder, and more isolated than before. It was a form of intellectual bullying. He controlled the conversation by elevating it to a level where the other person couldn't compete, effectively silencing them with his own perceived superiority. This schoolmaster attitude created a deep resentment. It wasn't just that he was out of touch, it was that he seemed to actively despise the messiness of human problems. He wanted the world to be a tidy spreadsheet, and he resented the people for being the unpredictable variables that ruined his calculations. Every interaction was a reminder that to Edward Heath, you were not a person with a story, you were a problem to be solved, and a tedious one at that.
Perhaps the most psychological layer of this coldness was rooted in a deep-seated shame about his own origins. Unlike the aristocrats he rubbed shoulders with, Heath was not born into power. He was the son of a carpenter and a maid, a boy from the working class who had clawed his way up the ladder of British society through sheer willpower and intelligence. Yet, instead of wearing his background as a badge of honor, a testament to the British dream, he spent his life trying to bury it. He adopted a plummy, strangled accent that became a subject of national parody, distorting his vowels to sound more posh than the Queen herself. This desperate need to hide his roots created a barrier of insecurity that no one could penetrate. He couldn't connect with the working class because he had spent a lifetime running away from them, and he couldn't fully relax with the upper class because he knew deep down he wasn't one of them. He was a man stranded in no man's land, alone with his piano and his sailing boat, the only two things that didn't require him to make small talk. This internal conflict manifested as the sulking, rude, lecturesome figure that the public came to loathe.
He pushed people away before they could get close enough to see the carpenter's son hiding behind the prime minister's suit. It is a sorrowful legacy. A man who reached the pinnacle of power, but died without the warmth of the people's love, remembered not for his policies, but for the chill he brought into every room. But if Edward Heath was rude because he was insecure about his low-born roots, our next star was rude because he believed he was a god among insects. We are leaving the gray world of politics and returning to the glittering lights of Hollywood's golden age. Our next subject was the definition of a gentleman on screen, the star of My Fair Lady, who taught the world about manners and elocution. But in real life, he was a tyrant who treated waiters and service staff with a cruelty that is hard to believe. He didn't just ignore them, he treated them like dogs, believing that anyone from the lower class existed solely to be barked at.
Number 8. Rex Harrison. To the cinematic world, he was the ultimate symbol of refinement. As Professor Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady, Rex Harrison taught us that the measure of a man was found in his diction, his manners, and his ability to elevate those around him. He was the sophisticated, albeit prickly, architect of a poor flower girl's transformation into a duchess. The audience forgave the character's arrogance because it was wrapped in wit and eventually a begrudging heart. But in reality, the arrogance was not a costume Rex Harrison took off at the end of the day, it was his skin. He was known throughout Hollywood and the West End not as a charming eccentric, but as a tyrant whose cruelty was as precise and cutting as his famous elocution. The industry whispered the truth that the public was too dazzled to see. Rex Harrison didn't just play a man who looked down on the lower classes, he genuinely believed they were beneath him. The disconnect between the gentleman on screen and the man in the flesh was jarring. On set, he was notoriously difficult, often reducing co-stars to tears with his sharp tongue and imperious demands. But it was his treatment of the little people, the service staff, the crew, and the fans that revealed the true darkness of his character. He moved through the world with an air of aristocracy that had curdled into pure malice. He didn't view a waiter or a doorman as a person doing a job. He viewed them as a utility, a prop that existed solely to facilitate his comfort. If that prop malfunctioned, if a drink was a minute late or a door wasn't held open wide enough, Harrison would unleash a torrent of abuse that was shocking in its ferocity. He possessed a temper that could go from 0 to 100 in a heartbeat, transforming the suave movie star into a screaming bully who seemed to derive actual pleasure from making others feel small.
Dining out with Rex Harrison was considered by many to be a form of extreme sport, where the risk of public humiliation was guaranteed. Witnesses recount harrowing scenes in high-end restaurants where Harrison would treat the waitstaff not like human beings, but like stray dogs. He wouldn't just ask for service, he would demand it with a click of his fingers or a sharp whistle, treating the professional staff with a disdain that made other diners cringe. If a waiter made a mistake, Harrison wouldn't offer a polite correction. Instead, he would dress them down at top volume, his famous voice booming across the dining room, dissecting the server's competence and intelligence while they stood there, mortified and unable to answer back. He treated their dignity as if it were something he had paid for along with the meal, something he could trample on because he was the star and they were the servants. This class-based cruelty extended violently to his fans. To approach Rex Harrison for an autograph was to take your life in your hands. There was no gracious star routine with him. If a fan dared to interrupt his day, they were often met with a reaction that bordered on the psychotic. He would scream at them to bugger off, his face contorted with rage, chasing them away as if they were lepers. He believed that the lower classes existed to serve him, not to speak to him. The idea that a commoner felt they had the right to address him directly was an insult to his sense of hierarchy. He wanted the adulation of the masses from the safety of the screen, but he despised the reality of their presence. It was a cold, transactional worldview. You pay to see me, I take your money, and we never, ever interact.
Ultimately, Rex Harrison's behavior was a manifestation of a deep, rotting soul that no amount of accolades could hide. He was a man who had everything: fame, fortune, talent, yet he walked around with a perpetual scowl, treating the world as if it owed him an apology. His rudeness wasn't just bad manners. It was a weapon he used to enforce a social distance he felt was necessary. He died a legend of the cinema, but those who knew him remember him as a man who was incapable of basic kindness to those he deemed inferior. He proved that you can wear the finest suits and speak the Queen's English perfectly, and still be the ugliest person in the room. But if Rex Harrison was a snob who played a snob, our next subject was a man who played a pompous fool, but took himself deadly seriously. We are moving to the beloved world of British sitcoms, to a man who led the Dad's Army. You know him as the bumbling Captain Mainwaring, the man who constantly shouted, "You stupid boy!" But in a twist of irony, in real life, he was the one who refused to mix with his castmates.
Number 9. Arthur Lowe. We often assume that the actors who play pompous, self-important buffoons are doing so with a wink to the audience, engaging in a shared joke about the absurdity of ego. Captain Mainwaring, the leader of the Dad's Army platoon, is one of the most cherished characters in British television history. He was a bank manager with delusions of military grandeur, a man desperately trying to command respect from a ragtag group of men who saw right through him. We laughed at Mainwaring because his self-importance was punctured by his incompetence. But when the cameras stopped rolling, the man behind the mustache, Arthur Lowe, maintained the pompousness without any of the warmth. The devastating truth about Arthur Lowe was that he didn't think Captain Mainwaring was a caricature to be mocked. He lived his life with the same rigid, class-obsessed stuffiness, but devoid of the vulnerability that made the character human. He wasn't playing a snob. He was a snob who happened to be acting. The atmosphere on the set of Dad's Army is remembered by most as a golden time of camaraderie and laughter, except when it came to the captain. While the rest of the cast, the men who played Wilson, Pike, Jones, and the others, would eat lunch together, share jokes, and bond like a real platoon, Arthur Lowe set himself apart. He viewed himself as a serious, high-church dramatic actor who had essentially been drafted into a lowbrow comedy against his better judgment. He physically segregated himself from his co-stars during breaks, retreating to his dressing room or a separate table, maintaining a distance that he felt befitted his status. It was a method acting exercise that never ended. He treated his fellow actors not as peers, but as subordinates, mirroring the dynamic of the show, but stripping it of its affection. To the cast and crew, this wasn't funny, it was isolating. He walked through the studio with a heavy, serious air, a man carrying the burden of his own self-importance, refusing to lower himself to the level of the troops.
This deep-seated insecurity about his artistic standing manifested most violently in his interactions with the public. Arthur Lowe had a catchphrase that became a national treasure, "You stupid boy." It was the line he barked at the young Private Pike in almost every episode, a line delivered with a mix of frustration and paternal tolerance. Naturally, when fans saw Arthur Lowe on the street, this was the phrase they wanted to hear, or more innocently, the phrase they would quote back to him with a smile, hoping to share a moment of recognition with a TV legend. But to Lowe, hearing "you stupid boy" from a stranger wasn't a tribute, it was a profound insult. He loathed the catchphrase. He despised the fact that his long, varied career in theater and drama had been eclipsed by 3 words in a sitcom. Witnesses describe encounters where eager fans, trembling with the thrill of seeing Captain Mainwaring in the flesh, would shout the famous line, expecting a laugh. Instead, Lowe would turn on them with a cold, genuine fury. He wouldn't play along. He would become visibly agitated, sometimes snapping back at them to show some respect. He felt that the public was mocking his dignity. He couldn't separate the affection of the fan from his own insecurity about being a comedy actor. To him, every repetition of that line was a reminder that the world didn't see him as the serious thespian he believed himself to be. It created a toxic dynamic where the very thing that made him loved, his comedic brilliance, was the thing he resented the most. He punished his fans for their loyalty, treating their joy as an annoyance that was beneath him. He wanted the applause of the Royal Shakespeare Company, and when he got the laughter of the living room instead, he reacted with a bitterness that chilled anyone who tried to approach him.
There is a profound sadness in the story of Arthur Lowe.
He was a man who achieved immortality in a role he seemed to fundamentally look down upon. He spent his life chasing a version of prestige that was stiff and formal, failing to realize that the laughter he generated was a form of love far more powerful than the polite applause of the theater. He was a prisoner of his own ego, trapped in the uniform of a character he considered inferior to his true talents. He died a beloved icon, but the man inside the uniform remained a stranger to the millions who adored him, a man who would rather be respected by a few than loved by the many. He built a wall of snobbery to protect a fragile identity, leaving behind a legacy of laughter on screen and a legacy of cold silence in the streets. But if Arthur Lowe was a grumpy man who merely wanted to be taken seriously, our final subject is a betrayal of a much higher magnitude. We end our journey with the ultimate deception. She was the girl next door, the national sweetheart with the bright red hair and the loud, infectious laugh. For decades, the public believed she was their best friend, a down-to-earth woman who hadn't let fame go to her head. But the cameras lied. Behind the scenes, Cilla Black was a nightmare who refused to speak directly to her own staff, forcing them to communicate through her husband to avoid low-level interaction. She treated cabin crew on flights like ghosts, refusing to acknowledge their presence. Prepare yourself for the final shattering of the illusion.
Number 10. Cilla Black. We end our journey not with a villain from a horror movie, or a brooding rock star, or a distant politician, but with a betrayal that feels far more personal. For 50 years, Cilla Black was the beating heart of British light entertainment. She was our Cilla, the girl from Liverpool with the fiery red hair and the loud, infectious laugh that could shatter glass and melt hearts in equal measure. On shows like Blind Date and Surprise, Surprise, she built a career on a foundation of warmth and radical approachability. She was the nation's best friend, the comforting aunt who would put her arm around you when you were crying and tell you that everything was going to be all right. Millions of families invited her into their living rooms every Saturday night, believing that the woman they saw on screen was exactly who she was in real life, down to earth, humble, and fundamentally one of us. But the truth, hidden for decades behind the studio lights and the carefully managed PR, was a cold, calculating reality that shatters the girl next door myth into a million jagged pieces. The shock of Cilla Black's true nature lies in the sheer magnitude of the deception. While other stars on this list were known to be difficult or aloof, Cilla's entire brand was built on empathy. She monetized connection. Yet reports from those who worked in the trenches of television production paint a portrait of a woman who viewed the very people she claimed to represent with a haughty, aristocratic disdain. The moment the director yelled cut, the smile would vanish, replaced by a stony, impenetrable mask. The warmth was a costume, and she took it off as easily as she took off her makeup. To the runners, the sound engineers, and the backstage staff, she wasn't a friend. She was an ice queen who operated with a level of entitlement that would make a royal blush. The realization that the Laura laughs were strictly for the cameras leaves a bitter taste, revealing that for Cilla, being ordinary was just a role she played to amass an extraordinary fortune.
The specific mechanics of her rudeness were bizarre and deeply dehumanizing, centering on a refusal to engage in direct communication with those she deemed beneath her. Cilla Black did not speak to the help. Instead, she utilized her husband and manager, Bobby Willis, as a human shield and a translator for her demands. Staff members recount excruciatingly awkward encounters, where they would be standing mere feet away from Cilla, asking a simple question about a microphone pack or a cup of tea. Instead of answering them, Cilla would turn to Bobby, who was standing right next to her, and say, "Bobby, tell him I don't want that," or "Bobby, tell her to move." She would talk about the person in the third person, as if they were a ghost or a piece of furniture, refusing to make eye contact or acknowledge their physical presence. This wasn't just shyness, it was a power play designed to establish a rigid hierarchy.
By forcing communication through a middleman, she was sending a clear, brutal message. You are not important enough to occupy my airspace. You are low level, and I am the star. Imagine the humiliation of a young production assistant, excited to work with a TV legend, being reduced to a non-entity in her presence, forced to play a game of telephone with a woman standing within arm's reach. It stripped the workers of their dignity, reinforcing a class divide that she had spent her public life pretending didn't exist. She created a bubble of exclusivity around herself, a sanitized zone where the voices of the working class, the very class she came from, were not allowed to penetrate. It was a rejection of her roots so total that it bordered on self-loathing, a desperate attempt to sever ties with the world she had risen from by treating its inhabitants as invisible.
Perhaps the most legendary tales of her icy demeanor come from the skies. Cabin crew on first-class flights are trained to deal with difficult passengers, but Cilla Black was in a league of her own. Stories abound of flight attendants approaching her seat to offer champagne or a menu, only to be met with absolute silence. She would stare straight ahead, reading her magazine, acting as if the crew member were a hallucination. If they persisted, she would allegedly snap, gesturing to her husband or a companion to deal with the interruption. One famous anecdote involves a stewardess asking Cilla what she would like to eat, only for Cilla to turn to her husband and say, "Bobby, tell her I'm not hungry." The stewardess, standing right there, was erased from the equation. It was a level of snobbery that transcended mere rudeness. It was a total negation of the other person's humanity. This behavior reveals the ultimate tragedy of celebrity culture. We project our own hopes and values onto these figures, desperate for them to be the heroes we see on the screen. We wanted Cilla to be the warm, cackling friend, but in reality, she was a woman who had climbed to the top of the ladder and then pulled it up behind her, refusing to even look down at the people holding it steady. The girl next door had moved to a gated community and locked the gates. As we close the file on these 10 stars, we are left with a sobering realization. The people who demand our love the loudest are often the ones who are least capable of returning it. They hated the intrusion, they hated the expectations, and in many ways, they hated us for making them who they were. The screen creates monsters, and sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones that smile the widest.